about the fictitious community in this book. So she is, as one critic said, uniquely positioned to write this book because she knows what the Mennonite religion is. That's her background, and she grew up in a community, albeit not, as I said, not as close a community, but still, she is a good one to write about this. A good one. She left, and she's critical of the community. So from a Mennonite perspective, maybe she's not. That's something to discuss afterwards. But I mean, I wish more of you had read the book, because then it's, it's a different kind of thing could be. But there's still what to discuss. So what is this? She describes this as her imagined response to crimes that were perpetrated against a group of Mennonite women in a community in Bolivia. And the book is, she has a note at the beginning of the book, which is called, she writes it, a note on the novel. And this is what she writes. Between 2005 and 2009, in a remote Mennonite community in Bolivia named Manitoba Colony, which is kind of ironic for Miriam Toews, the author. This community in Bolivia is called Manitoba Colony after the Mennonite community in Manitoba. And that's where Miriam Toews, the author of this book, is from. So, and it's named after the province of Manitoba in Canada. Many girls and women would wake in the morning feeling drowsy and in pain, their bodies bruised and bleeding, having been attacked in the night. The attacks were attributed to ghosts and demons. Some members of the community felt the women were being made to suffer by God or Satan as punishment for their sins. Many accused the women of lying for attention or to cover up adultery. Still others believed everything was the result of wild female imagination. So then she says, so this is my book about wild female imagination that I wrote. Eventually, it was revealed that 8 men from the colony had been using an animal anesthetic to knock their victims unconscious and attack them, to rape them. In 2011, these men were convicted in a Bolivian court and received lengthy prison sentences.
Good.
One gentleman decided that.
Yeah, maybe. I think I'm just reading from the information. Yeah.
Maybe if it was men talking.
Anyway.
He might come back.
Okay. Yeah. Anyways, so that's what happened, and that's the true story. That they were using this animal anesthetic was used to knock the victims unconscious and rape them. In 2011, these men were convicted in a Bolivian court and received lengthy prison sentences. In 2013, while the convicted men were still in jail, it was reported that similar assaults and other sexual abuses were continuing to take place in the colony. So obviously, not all the perpetrators were caught. Women Talking, writes Miriam Toews, the author, is both a reaction through fiction to these true life events and an act of female imagination. Because one of the things that the men in the book, when they're saying that, oh, women, they're female imagination, they're just, like the word hysteria comes from, women are hysterical and their female imagination. But unfortunately, when you read, and I read, if anybody's interested, there's a long article that was published in the magazine, I think just went bankrupt, online magazine called Vice. A reporter went to this place in Bolivia, and he spoke to, and he a long article about what happened, and it was awful. I mean, as disturbing as the book is, it's not so disturbing, but what really happened was terrible. And so Miriam Toews said, the author, that she was living in Toronto in 2018. That's where she lives now. And when the trial of this man from this community revealed the extent and the horrific extent of these crimes. So it was like more than 130 women had been repeatedly anesthetized. Like it wasn't just it happened once, it happened night after night with this sedative spray that was meant for animals and raped in their homes in this very, as I said, ultra conservative, isolated community, Manitoba colony in Bolivia. But the women, it took them a while because they didn't understand what was happening because they'd been anesthetized. But when they woke up in the convent, it was like, and some of them were young girls. I mean, they had no idea what was going on. And it was girls and their mothers in the same house. And it was just awful. And so she said, but the women, when they spoke up, they were told that perhaps the devil had attacked them, or maybe nothing had happened, and these tales were merely an invention of wild female imagination. So that's what they were told. She said.
By the men.
Yes, or I mean, I don't know, maybe by a couple of women too, but definitely by the men. So she said, Toews said that I felt the need, an obligation to write about these women. And she said, she knows that she is descended from the Molochna, and that's the name in the book. It's called the Molochna colony. In the novel, in real life, it's the Manitoba colony, but in the book, she calls it the Molochna colony. And apparently that was the place in what is now Ukraine on the Black Sea. That's where the Mennonite community began. And apparently the history of it, I should have printed out my audit and looked up the history of it, that the Mennonites lived there until the communists came into power at the beginning of the 20th century. And the Mennonites, one of the tenets of their faith is pacifism, and that didn't go well. And pacifism, also they were a religion, and that wasn't what the Bolsheviks wanted or what the communists wanted in their new communist paradise. So they left, and Canada offered them land because they were farmers. So that's how they came to Canada. So they moved from Ukraine to Canada, and that's why they were out west, in Manitoba and there. But then
The cream of the crop.
the cream of the crop. So they went there and lived there, and they were very happy because at the beginning of the 20th century, so it was pretty rural, and they could do what they wanted, and they could educate their women, or well, not educate their women, but they could live their lives, and they could farm, and nobody would bother them, and they were given land by the Canadian government that was encouraging immigration and that continued for a while, and then apparently the irony, or at least probably for Miriam Toews, is that they, as things got more modern, the community was not as isolated as it had been originally. So the real, ultra conservative members of the community needed a more isolated place to go to. And that's when they went further down south. They went to Mexico and to Paraguay. And then they moved, and then Mexico enacted I forgot to print out with all the dates, but Mexico at some point enacted some legislation that you had to educate women also. And this did not go over well with the Mennonites who had left, the ones who really did not believe that women should be educated. So they moved further south, and big communities were set up in Bolivia. So that's how you came to have these Mennonite communities, I think that's Bolivia, but that's the history of the Mennonite communities. They started there in Ukraine, and they went to Canada, and then they went further south. Yeah.
I'm curious. I had no idea they originated in Ukraine, and I'm wondering why they spoke like Plattdeutsch.
So that's also I didn't understand, because I thought, why are they speaking Plattdeutsch, which is this old form of Low German? I don't know, maybe the founder was originally from somewhere in, I don't know, I have to look up a little more, but that's at least the language that they speak here, and that Miriam Toews said they also spoke. I don't know, maybe because Ukraine was, it's not, I don't know. Anyway, but that's right. So you would think it wasn't Ukrainian that they were speaking, or Russian. It's this language and that's also a big part of the story, because in this story, the women in this community, and when you read the book, it's really worth reading. It's just 200 pages, a small book, not difficult. But these women, they are so smart and funny and acerbic, and they have this whole kind of Socratean debate between them amongst themselves when that's the action of the story. I'll tell you what it is in a minute, but they are illiterate. because they were not taught to read. And they don't speak the language of their surroundings. So in this case, they don't speak Spanish. They only speak this German language that nobody else speaks. So the idea of them leaving the colony is a very frightening one. They don't have language and they can't read or write. So this is what, and she emphasized. So that's why she wrote it. So she said that this is what she did. Then in the book, the next page are 3 like pictograms labeled 1, 2, 3, numbered 1, 2, 3. So the first one, you can't really see it. It's like supposed to be clouds over a field, very stylized. The second one looks like a man and a woman holding daggers and like dueling with each other. And the third one is a horse from the back that's turning its head, but we see the rear view of the horse. 1, 2, 3. So that's on the next page. And then the next page says minutes of the women talking. So this is where the book gets its title and the movie as well, Women Talking. And she writes, pertaining to the meetings in the Molochna colony on June 6 and 7, 2009, as recorded by August F. Again, this is fiction. Like, I don't think there was anybody recording this. And present, and there are the Lowen women and 4 names. And then there are the Friesen women and 4 other names. So you have to, I kept going back to this. I don't know who was the one person who read. Yeah, because I kept getting mixed up. So which one is it? And did you find the same thing? I guess, I mean, yeah, kind of after a while you remember, okay, she's so-and-so's daughter and she's so-and-so's niece and that, and the book takes place really over a period of 2 days, June 6th and June 7th. And what is the structure of the book? Well, the narrator, as when he introduces the story, says, my name is August F. Irrelevant for all purposes, other than I have been appointed the minute taker for the women's meetings because the women are illiterate and unable to do it themselves. And as these are the minutes, and I, the minute taker, and as I am a school teacher and daily instruct my students to do the same, I feel my name should be included at the top of the page together with the date. Ona Friesen, also of the Molochna colony, is the woman who asked me if I would take the minutes. Although she didn't use the word minutes, but rather asked if I would record the meetings and create a document pertaining to them. So this book is the documents, the recording of these conversations or minutes, if you want to call it that these women had, that whoever this man, August F, is, he is the minute taker. And he says that, and then he starts to explain. He says that this Ona is a woman of his age, asked him to take the minutes, and there's this scene in the beginning with the 2 of them where she says to him, please, we're organizing these meetings, and I would like you to record them because none of us can write or read. And then afterwards he thinks to himself, but why am I doing this? Because the women can't read this, none of them are able to read, so who am I recording this for? But recording it, that's what she asked, and then it turns out that this August has been in love with Ona ever since they were children, and that's a thread that goes through. I don't know if it was in the movie, but it's this narrator of the book, August, is very much enamored and has been for years and years with Ona. So, and then he says, the meetings have been organized hastily by Agatha Friesen and Rita Lowen in response to the strange attacks that have haunted the women of Molochna for the past several years. Since 2005, nearly every girl and woman have been raped by what many in the colony believe to be ghosts or Satan, supposedly as punishment for their sins. And he explains. So here, if you didn't know the background, he's going to tell us. And he says, I recognize only one of the men barely because he and I had played together when we were children. The other perpetrators are much younger than me, and they hadn't been born or they were babies when I left with my parents. So the narrator has been away for many years. We're not sure why until the end of the story when everything becomes clear. And now he's back in the place, and he's living as a kind of pariah in their society, but he's been appointed school teacher for the boys by the leader or bishop or whatever his title is, his last name is Peters, and Peters says that Peters was the one who asked him to become, said, okay, you could come back, you August F. narrator of the story are allowed to come back. For whatever reason, we don't know yet why he was sent off with his parents exiled from the colony years earlier. You can come back, and why would you want to come back anyway, but come back and you're gonna live apart in this shed, and you're gonna be the school teacher, you're gonna teach the boys reading and writing and basic arithmetic. That's all you need to teach. And so, he says that, so now they came to me, these women, after what had happened. So what happened one night, it seemed one of the women, so the women started to, they didn't know what was going on. And one of them tried one night to stay awake and stayed awake the whole night till and then she heard somebody coming in. She and her daughter wrestled, and this was true, like this would you read the true report, wrestled the intruder into the, like down to the ground, and they called, I don't know who they called, like she called her husband and others, and he was arrested by their local colony police, I don't know, but whoever. And then he named the names of the 7 others. So 8 men in total were arrested. And for the first time, Peters, the head of this colony, together with the elders, decided to call in the police. They'd never called in the outside police force before to their colony. But he decided to have the men arrested for their own safety, presumably, because if the women got angry enough, they might become violent and kill these men. And they were taken away to the city. So when the book opens, the remaining men of the colony, except for the senile or decrepit and myself for humiliating reasons, but we only find out at the end what the reason is, have gone to the city. So the women are alone in the colony now for a couple of days because the other men have gone to the city to post bail for the imprisoned attackers in the hope that they will be able to return to Molochna while they await trial. And when the perpetrators return, now this is what the book is. It's not so much, and it's very nicely done, and I think the movie the same thing, that it wasn't meant as an expose or to dwell on the horrors of the attacks, because they were like just the little mention that were horrific enough. But it was, which in a way maybe, I don't know, say horrible, but just what happened. So what was going to happen is the men from the colony was going to post bail, bring these guys back, and then they would be put on trial by their peers there in the community. And either they would be convicted, and then I don't know what would happen, they would be put into some kind of prison if they had there, or they would be acquitted. But when the perpetrators returned, the women of Molochna, according to our narrator, this man, August F., who is a misfit, so we say it that way, but we don't know why, and he's our narrator and the record keeper of what's going on. They will be given the opportunity to forgive these men, thus guaranteeing everyone's place in heaven. And this is the big thing upon which the discussions rest, or a part of the discussions rest, but is one of the underlying factors. Now, to me, this was really fascinating because, you know, in a world which is largely secular, I don't know statistically the whole world, but definitely in, you know, the film reviews that you read or the book reviews that you read, the New York Times and the Guardian and most of the papers are very, very secular and generally look at people who are very religious as being a little, you know, odd, outdated, old-fashioned, I don't know what. Like, it's okay, you do your little thing, but live your lives really according. But here you have this in contrast to a community that's whole existence is based on their religion, and that's why they're separate. That's why they're apart. That's why they're in Bolivia, not even in Manitoba, because Manitoba is too worldly and modern. That this is what the women are going to be asked to do, and you think to yourself, rapists, they're horrible. They're, you know, they did things, nobody's denying the women were there and it was seen what had happened to these women. It was terrible. They were violated. And how could but really, and that's what, a big part of what the women are debating was, what should we do? Should we forgive them or should we not forgive them? And a lot, and the debates are really, as I say, you know, for these supposedly simple, uneducated women who don't know how to read or write, their arguing is quite sophisticated. They're debating theology, they're debating, you know, issues, philosophical issues that very well educated people, literate people don't debate because that's their world. And so this is what they have to do. So the problem for these women isn't just, you know, what should we do about these men, but in that, you know, what punishment do they deserve, or how are we going to protect ourselves and our children and our nieces and all the other women, but it's, do we forgive them? Because if we forgive them, then they will go to heaven and we will go to heaven. But then it's so interesting because I guess it's a very Christian way of looking at the idea of forgiveness, because Peter's, the head honcho in the community, says that if the women don't forgive the men, the women will have to leave the colony for the outside world. What? Of which they know nothing. The women have very little time, only 2 days to organize their response. So the book is they're talking, debating, talking. That's the title, is Brilliant Women Talking, because that's what they do for these 2 days, because they have to decide. I know you think to yourself, what? That doesn't make any sense, but it makes perfect sense. And it's not as if it doesn't make sense to the women, because these are women who believe. It's not, you know, like we could look at them and say, but this is terrible, this is crazy, you're subjected to horrible things, you're kept like, and even they say amongst themselves, we're like animals, we're like beasts of burden to our husband, because they use us and use us and use us. We do all the chores, we do all because this is a farming community, and they eschew modern technology to the point where, as she explained, they have buggies, no cars, horse and buggy. That's why the picture of the horse. They think, why is there a horse there? Because that's the mode of transportation. They have horses and buggies. And even on the buggies, they're not supposed to have steel rims on the tires of the buggies, because that can make them go quicker to the outside world. So that's and there are no telephones and there's no, you know, radio, and the women are illiterate. So think of, you know, like put yourself like this is, and yet the conversation is witty and acerbic, and those 2 days of the women talking are really very interesting.
And also,
Yeah.
there have to have been lots of pregnancies.
So, well, one of the, so we find out, I mean, there were pregnancies, and we find out that Ona, this other woman who is unmarried, who our narrator, August F, is in love with, that she is pregnant. And she's pregnant by an attacker, because she had never married, as I said, she's a spinster in the colony, she's around 40 years old, and she's pregnant. So yes, there were.
But, and then if all the men are aware of what's going on, then the husband.
So
must be
that's
aware as
what
well.
to yourself, well, if the husband's like, so there was apparently outrage, because these were women who had husbands. So I think, but how did that happen? So apparently the attackers would go, they had these cans of this anesthetic, and who, you know, how did they get the anesthetic? Well, they had livestock. So I guess they, you know, the sedatives that were used for animals were around, and that wasn't difficult to get. Would climb in and spray the whole like room with these sedatives. So even the rest of the family was groggy as well. The husbands also of the women were groggy. So I mean, I don't know all the details, but it seems like in that long article when the reporter went down there so that's what was happening. But you think that the husbands would be outraged, and some of them were. I think in real life, some of them were. There's not that much mention here. But what comes out here, and I don't know if this is part of her fictitious, let's say, taking liberty with writing fiction, that it's not so emphasized that the husbands are furious that their wives were attacked, or they are, but the pressure in the call, and then there's this whole idea that, and also Peters, the bishop, forbids anybody to talk to the press, because he said, you know, when this got out, when this happened, both in real life and in the book, then press is gonna want to, I mean, this was some story, like the reporter from Vice who went in 2000 and I forget when, 2011, and went into the colony and spoke to people. But that was a very unwanted thing, because you don't want bad press coming in there. So it was this don't speak, and don't speak to the outside world, because then we're just gonna give our group, our faith, a terrible reputation. So it's it's all like you think, yeah, how, and how did they, and there's this part in the book where there's this little girl comes in, she's 3 years old, and apparently she had been one of the victims. A 3-year-old, oh my goodness, she's making, but the worst part is, she didn't make that up. That was true, because the ages of the women in real life were between 3 and 65. 3, and you think 3 is a was a 3-year-old, was a 3-year-old family member, or what do you do with a 3-year-old? I mean, it's just so awful. And this little 3-year-old, again, it just nothing, you know, there are no, what's the word, salacious or voyeuristic scenes, but you just have to imagine, or try not to imagine, because you have these images in your head of the horror of this. And so that's why Toews said, I felt the need, an obligation, I wanted to write about these women, because I felt that I easily could have been one of them. But the timing of the release, so she started the book in 2011, which was quite a while ago. But, and 2018 was when the book was published. But in the meantime, and Miriam Toews, so her other books, A Complicated Kindness, I think, The Summer of My Amazing Luck, 1996, A Boy of Good Breeding, 1998, Swing Low, A Life in 2000, and then A Complicated Kindness in 2004. Swing Low, A Life was about her father. That was not fiction. That was about her father, who had walked in front of a train and committed suicide in their community of Steinbach, Manitoba, where she came from. Her father suffered from manic depression or bipolar disorder, whatever term you want to use, which is, you know, extremes of mania with severe depression. And so she felt, Miriam, the daughter, the author, wrote a book about her father. It was a tribute to his life. So that was nonfiction. Then came A Complicated Kindness, then The Flying Troutmans, which I don't remember if we did that or not. Then a book called Irma Vaught, and 2014, All My Puny Sorrows. And All My Puny Sorrows, you think to yourself too, how, you know, it's what a terrible thing to lose a father like this. But as she was working on this book, Women Talking, her sister, Marjorie, Miriam Toews' sister, did the same thing on the train tracks in Steinbach, Manitoba, where her father, Melvin, and Miriam's father had done the same thing 12 years earlier. So she said, after my sister committed suicide, I thought, I'm never going to get out of bed again in the morning. I can't do this. But after a while, she's an author, and she got out of bed again, and she wrote All My Puny Sorrows, which is a tragic comedy story of one sister's life and another's death. But that's not that she made a fiction, but that was because of that second tragedy in her own life. And that became a bestseller, that book. But she said, I still had that idea of the women of the Manitoba colony in my head, and I never stopped thinking about it. And she said, I kept wondering, then what? Then what? What do these women do after they learn the truth of these violations, this attack of body and faith? Because it's not only an attack on their body, but it's an attack on their faith. And yet they're told that, okay, you were violated, these men did something that wasn't good. But if they come back and if they ask you for forgiveness, you have to forgive them, because if you don't forgive them, you're jeopardizing their place in heaven and your own, because it's a tenet of the Mennonite faith that if somebody asks you for forgiveness, you have to forgive them. And if you don't forgive them, then you're not going to make it up to heaven. So there's the afterlife is hanging over the heads of these women, which complicates everything. So here you have these supposedly, as I said, simple women, uneducated, debating these enormous philosophical issues and issues of faith. I mean, this is literally life and death, and it's not just in this world, but it's in the eternal world after, which if you believe in it, you believe in it, and this is really serious business. So again, as you know, secular readers, we could say, oh, sort of roll our eyes or things like it. But that's not what the women of the community were dealing with. And that's really, so yes, this is fiction. And no, if they set it up or if they didn't, and apparently the women, none of them left the community in the real life. But this is how Miriam Toews, a novelist, chose to deal with the issue. And she said that, so what in her book, what do the women do? In her version, they meet secretly in a hayloft. That's where the action is. In fact, I could imagine, I think I'd like to see the book now that I live film now that I read the book, because I think it was supposedly very well done. It won awards, I think, at this year's, right, at the Oscars.
It was, yeah.
Did Sarah, like, for what, was it best film or best director or
I think both.
both?
It like took so many.
Took so many awards, so that would put it on the list, because I didn't do it like when it came out in 2018, but then there was all this buzz about the film, and I said, oh, you know what, maybe we should do this, like, this is interesting. So, so she said, so the action, and you can even see it as a play, you know, I kept thinking of it in my mind as a play, because the action is in this hayloft, and everything else could, and the women are there in this hayloft, and our narrator in the story is sitting there writing and taking minutes. And so what do the women here do? They're perched on their milk buckets in this hayloft, and they talk and talk and talk. And in a place where, as one of them puts it, women live out their days as mute, submissive, and obedient servants. Animals. That's one of the women says that. That's what we are. We are like animals. Although animals might have it a little better than we do, because the animals are probably treated better by the men than we are. And in this community, simply gathering for these women to gather without permission, because they didn't ask anybody's permission. The men folk, except for the, you know, for the simple or senile, have all gone off to the city to try and bail out the rapists. So just by them gathering without permission is an act of subversion. That's the women's first act of subversion. And engaging in a 2-day long Socratic dialogue on forgiveness, innocence, and love is flat out transgressive. It's an enormous transgression, right? Maybe not quite as bad as not forgiving, if that's what they're not going to do, but this is so what they did. So she said, Miriam Toews, I have always been trying to challenge the patriarchy, and that's her, this is the honor, specifically of my Mennonite community. But I'm concerned with the suppression of girls and women, especially, and any place in the world that falls under fundamentalist authoritarian thinking. So that's her perspective on the world, and that's what she wants to do, and she thinks about a lot. You could see why she left her Mennonite community when she was 18 years old. She said, I think that my work, my writing, and my life, I've always been attempting to do that. As they used to say, stick it to the man. That's the thing that I left, but it was that. But anyway, so she says that she decided to start the book, and I don't know, well, one of you or read it as you read it, okay, and or in the film too, because I saw a little clip of the film, and it was in there, was this foot washing, where the women begin the proceedings by washing each other's bare feet. The two teenage girls who are there giggle as they're doing it. The older women take it very seriously, which apparently is, I think in Christian theology, like Christian belief, that's because Jesus had his feet washed by his disciples for the Last Supper. He washed their feet. Sorry, he washed their. So foot washing is seen as a a compassionate gesture. And so that's where she begins. And that's what the women decide to do, which is really quite something when you think what they're going to be discussing and the reason that they're discussing what they're discussing, the horrors that happen to them. And they begin with this lovely, healing, compassionate gesture. So she said, Miriam Toews said, that I decided to start my story, my book, with this healing gesture rather than depicting the rapes. And that was in part, for me, to an effort to avoid salaciousness. Like, I didn't want this to be descriptions of the attacks. She said, and I don't like the media phase. Apparently this was the phase that the media used, ghost rapes. That's what they called it when they referred to it, because the women didn't know what was going on. It's not accurate to me, and it perpetuates the ignorance around the attacks, because it echoes what the elders of the community were saying. They called it ghost rapes, because then it could insinuate that what didn't really happen. It was, ghosts, just as ghosts are not real, well, these things probably weren't real as well. And these things were very, very real. And some of the women had begun to think of themselves that way and think in that way. Could it have been demons, the devil, Satan, punishment, ghosts, something I did wrong, I sinned, and I'm being punished for my sins? So she said that using that term by journalists really bothered me. She said, when I heard, this is Toews talking, when I first heard about the attacks, I was horrified, but not surprised. The details were shocking, but these types of crimes occur in places like this, where you have extremist, closed communities. Toews believes they are ripe for violence. And in her novel, the women talk of this little 3-year-old who now has a sexually transmitted infection and is not permitted medical treatment. Described here why, because the Bishop Peters feels that it wouldn't be good for her to go outside of check if the treatment she needs in the community, wouldn't be good for her to go, because then at whatever clinic she would go to, they would start to gossip, like, this girl in this community, 3 years old, how does a 3-year-old come to have such a disease? So no, so she's not being allowed to be treated. One of the other horrors, horrific enough to thought of anybody violating a 3-year-old, but this is what came of it is almost as horrifying. And the conversations in the book. One woman defends the conversation. So this, this idea of asking the man for forgiveness, what should we do? But really the topic of the conversation are to decide the 3 options. Do we do nothing? Just nothing? Let the men take care of dealing with the perpetrators? Option 2, do we stay and fight, whatever the fighting entails? Or do we pack ourselves up with our young children and leave? Those are the 3 options. So they have a kind of election, which again is something for these women, but they can't read and write. So I think there's a scene in the bit of the film that I saw. There's a scene where the women, they can make a little X or a mark, and there are 3 pictograms, and I think that's what she put this in the book, that there were 3 options, and the women are explained. Come and decide what you think you want to do. Do you want to do nothing? Do you want to stay and fight, or do you want to leave? And so the do nothing option is the least popular. So that was interesting. There are women, and one of them in the film, I don't know which, some actress, I'm not good with actresses and names, but her name in the book is Scarface Jans. And she is of the we will stay, because this is a test for us, and it's a test for our faith, and we will forgive them when they come back, and we will just go on. These are our lives, and this is what we believe in, and do nothing. But the other 2 options are the popular ones. So they have to decide. And these women were given permission by the rest of the women. You make the decision for us. They were the committee, like that. Do we stay and fight, or do we leave? So the 2 days of debate is what is going to decide. And they only have 2 days. Why? Because within 2 days, the men are going to come back. So they have to make up their minds. So if they're going to stay, okay, they stay. But if they're going to leave, they have to pack themselves up and pack up their children and go before the men come. And then that's also another part of the discussion. So this is the debate. What do we do? Should we do it? And the women back and forth, back and forth. Why should we do this? Should we not do this? And the should we avenge, should we forgive? That's the big question. And one of the characters asks her, Marish, I don't know how to pronounce his name, probably, but Marish Lowen raises her hand. So, because the discussion was, one of them says that we're like animals. And then another one of the women reacts and says, what the story proves is that animals can fight back, they can run away. So animals at least have two options. So what should we do? And it doesn't matter whether we are animals or not, says the woman, says, I can tell one of the women, or whether we have been treated like animals or not, or even if we can know the answer to that one way or the other. Either way, it's a waste of time to try to establish whether we are animals or not, when the men will soon be returning back from the city. Like, ladies, come on. But still, there's back and forth and debating, and you're thinking to yourself as you're reading it, ladies, like it's all, you've got to get a move on, because the men are going to be back. So the other woman from the other family raises her hand and says, she asserts herself that in her opinion, the most important question to ask is not whether the women are animals, and they're recognizing, this is the women themselves saying, we're treated like animals, or are we being treated like animals? But rather, should the women avenge the harm perpetrated against them? Or should they instead forgive the men, and by doing so, be allowed to enter the gates of heaven? So as I say, this is the crux of the discussion. We will be forced to leave the colony, she says, if we don't forgive the men and or accept their apologies. And through the process of this excommunication, we will forfeit our place in heaven. So what do they do? And that's it. What do they do? More discussion. And this is how the book goes on. And she says, the author of the book says, I've spent a lot of time with Mennonite women, and there is a certain kind of natural, inherent storytelling capacity, says Toews. Not to the point where they're really being disobedient. They know their roles and they play them. Stupid. They're, uneducated. But when they get together, she said, there's a lot of laughter and their own kind of coded rebellious exchange. And the dialogue among the women is interesting because they don't speak, they're not, it's not prudish, and they're quite they can use curse words, and they talk, and they joke. There's humor in the stories. This combination, which Miriam Toews is known for, that she combines serious subjects, i.e., the suicide of her sister, with humor. And I guess that's how she is able to deal with the terrible things that happen in her own life. And so then she can take a subject like this, which is a horrible subject, or a subject about a horrible happening, and she makes a book that has moments of humor. I don't know, I imagine in the movie the women must have been funny. One of the characters, Salome, is a really she's the one who always seems to get the last word in and the word in edgewise, and she wants to stay and fight, and she's ready to fight. She is always, she talks back, and she's one who doesn't seem that's going to be told what to do. And yet, other times, she lives in this Mennonite community. She's not running away. She doesn't say, we don't believe, nobody is renouncing their faith. None of the women. That, to me, was an interesting part. So Toews says, when they get together, there's a lot of laughter, there's, kidding around, and this is kind of rebellion in their way. And I wanted to put that into the book. And she does. And, she has these funny tangents when you'll read it about one child gets a cherry stone stuck in his nose. And how do you get this out? The women have to, the woman who's looking after the children comes and says, the little boy has a cherry stone stuck in his nose. And then they say, cherries? Who has cherries? You know, that's a cherry. The next lady got some cherries from somewhere, because that's such an unheard of treat. And how did the stone get there? How did this? And meanwhile, and then another one of the women blows out the cherry pears. So there are these incidents. So she mixes comedy with the tragedy. And another part of the tragedy is that their choices are curtailed by their illiteracy and their limited understanding of the larger world. Illiteracy and not speaking the local language. They literally don't know. They've never seen a map. Imagine, they don't know where they are in the world. Isn't that interesting metaphor today? Where are they in the world? They're in their Mennonite community, and that's what they know. They know there's a city to the north. There are two other Mennonite communities close-ish by, because there's mention of the two other communities, but they don't know where they are. East, north, I mean, they know maybe what they need for agriculture, but that's it. So this idea of a map, how, if they want to leave, where will they know how to go? How will they know where to go? Because none of them can read a map. And one of them says, okay, so maybe we could create our own map as we go along. Yeah, maybe, but, and she says here, the author, that the narrator August, who is this gentle, sweet, sort of definitely an outcast, and literally, I will give you away the whole thing because most of you haven't read it, but an outcast for a very good reason. And when she puts this bit at the end, she said, but this character of August, and it's so interesting, her choice of names, because August, the narrator, when I looked up, like, what does August, to be august, is really somebody who is respected and impressive. Her narrator is the least respected and impressive man there in his own community. She gives him the name August. She has Salome, this lively, battling, strong-willed woman, and Salome, the original word, it comes from the Hebrew shalom, which means peace, and she is like not the one for that. The only one, because I was looking up names, is Ona, which I think I'm sure she's in the film too, the one who August has been in love with ever since they were children. Her name means gracious, and she is definitely gracious. She is she's this lovely character in the story. But Toews said, August, the character of August, the narrator, is inspired by my own father, especially his gentleness. My dad was a teacher too. And so to the others in the Mennonite community, there was always something suspect about him. He was considered effeminate or demasculinized. And that's what our August here is, that, you know, he doesn't know how to eviscerate a hog, or he doesn't know how to whatever these manly chores. And the women even made fun of him, the other women. And he's there writing down the minutes, and you know, he's not a real man's man. And she modeled him a little bit, as she says, inspired by my own father. And she said, men's options in that world are so limited as well. As August, her narrator character puts it, they are all together trapped in the crucible of this crushing experiment, i.e. the Mennonite isolated way of life as she sees it. She says, when she remembers that growing up in Steinbach, Manitoba, one of the worst things a young woman could be was wild. That was the adjective, to be wild. And of course, she probably was called that all the time. And she said that in her book and in the news reports of the trial, the phrase wild female imagination is deployed to erase the rapes, reminiscent of, you know, other times where women's statements of being violated were dismissed. But she said, the wild female imagination is also the stuff of art. She said, I never thought of myself as wild. I was feisty. That's what I was. And her parents, she said, were both well-educated and unusually progressive in their community. So she said, at age 18, she skipped her high school graduation and got on a train and went to Montreal, where she lived for a number of years. Then afterwards, she moved to Toronto, and she lives in Toronto. Interesting, because I wondered, like, what's her background after she left? The author, she had a son and a daughter, worked in journalism, published her first novel in 1996, and then she was separated or divorced and married from the first husband, and now she lives with a second partner in Toronto. But she always wanted to write. And the early novels were composed mainly, she went back to Winnipeg, she was Montreal, then she went back to Winnipeg, then now she lives in Toronto. So her early novels were set, if you remember, in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, where her husband, her first husband, was a street performer. And the family often followed him in an old VW van across Canada while he ate fire in front of crowds. So there's an interesting, that is the author of the book. They split up a few years ago, according to this article, and Toews is now about close to 60. She has a granddaughter and she's living in Toronto. And she says that All My Puny Sorrows, that novel emerged from grief, the grief of losing her sister. But Women Talking was written in a different kind of anguish. And she said, when that story of what happened to those women of the Mennonite community that could have been me was always with me, even though I didn't put it into a novel for a number of years because the other book came in the way. But she said, I felt such a weight of responsibility to get it right because I didn't want to get it wrong, because she sees herself as a representative also of the Mennonite community. And so that's what she has this, and it's an unusual structure because it's only over 2 days. It's in this hayloft. The women are talking and talking and talking, and it's just talking. So, I mean, maybe you find it too much and you might not like it, although it's, you can, I guess, kind of flip through it if you think that it's too much. It's not a very long book. And as I said, the voices are not sanctimonious. They're witty, they're feisty. You've got descriptions of all these different women talking, and then here and there, little bits of the outside life come in, like the child getting the cherry pit stuck in his nose, or the senile man in whose hayloft they're perched comes in, and he used to be, as she says, a very nice, polite gentleman until he became senile, and then his language became foul, and he doesn't really know anything other than Peter's, the bishop, head of the community, stole his cloth, and that's the only thing he remembers. So there's a lot of humor in the story. And she said, and the names, and I had all those names and the chorus of voices. She said it was one of the most difficult things that I've ever written. I don't know if a brain can explode in one's head, but while I was writing it, I really felt that that was going to happen in mine. And I really had to finish it because otherwise I thought this book is going to kill me. She said, I'm very aware that the book has landed in a politically charged climate. Okay, so that was back, 4 or 5 years ago. Now the movie is out. So I guess you could say, relevant again, or always relevant, because the subject of men violating women is as old as humankind existed, and seems like it's not going to go away because of the way men and women are made. But what happens to it, and what happens to the men? But she says the men who were charged were convicted in real life. I don't know what's happening. So in the book, there's an ending, and we don't know. I mean, the men were convicted and they were put in jail, but are they going to be brought back, and are the women going to be asked to forgive them, and what are the women going to do? So the women do, in the story, the women make a decision, and in the book they decide to leave. We don't know what's going to happen to them, but finally, and our poor August, the narrator, says, I don't know how I'm going to continue living after these women are gone. Not only Bona, who he's still in love with, and she goes along too, but we don't know what will happen after that. But she said in real life, the men who were charged were convicted, were in prison, but then there were reports of other alleged assaults in the colony. And she said, I have seen the warmth and the love that the Mennonite community can provide, but there are also problems. So she said, I feel that she, the author, because she comes from a community like that, can be and have to be self-critical. So that's why she chose to write the book. So it's a quick read. The subject is painful and disturbing, but the voices are interesting and intelligent. And I say there's humor in it. It's I like the way she set it up, and it's really only over a period of 2 days. There's a lot to the story, which if you haven't read it, can't have a discussion about it. This is me just telling it to you. So read it. And it sounds like the film was well done, like you saw the film, and yeah.
The actress that did the lead was Frances McDormand.
Oh,
yeah.
Which one did she play? Which one did she
She
play?
played the one that didn't leave. I think. She
Oh,
had
yeah,
a scar on
Scarface
her
Janice.
face.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, she played,
That was a
yeah,
born.
yeah.
What was the question?
No, she was just saying which actress played because they were very well-known actresses. Salome is played by, one who played the queen in the queen, you know, in the crown.
Yeah.
At one point, what's her name? Ullman? No, it wasn't that one. It was a different.
I can,
one of the queens. Anyway, it was,
I'm looking.
yes. Any questions or comments or make some first and then, yes.
There's two things.
Yeah.
About the movie, it's gonna be shown here.
Yes.
And the movie series is the first one shown.
Oh,
In July. the
Okay.
first one shown.
Oh.
With Gail, you know?
Yeah, the Bright Lights Film Club.
Yeah, then the film club. So it's gonna be the first one showing in
Okay.
July, I think on a Thursday at 2:00. But I have a question as well.
Yeah.
I guess in Bolivia, they didn't have to educate the women like the state.
no,
didn't
so
have.
that was, at least from the bit that I read, that was the reason that they kept moving, that they didn't have to, they weren't forced by law of the land to educate the women in
But
their
here
public school
in
system.
Canada, in that
They had to.
they had to. educate.
Yeah, and they didn't like that
And
idea.
also, I myself, maybe other people have been too, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I've been there and I've seen the Amish.
Mhm.
So it's a similar kind of a community. And I think it's perhaps more open in the United States.
I don't know what the Amish versus the Mennonite, you know, you have to be careful
They're all
about
from-
saying.
Well, the Amish they call themselves also, they speak a German dialect.
Yeah, right,
And
Right.
they call themselves Pennsylvania
Dutch,
Dutch, but it's
yeah.
really Dutch.
yeah,
So I think they're all from the same.
Yeah.
area.
Yeah.
Area. But I think the Amish perhaps came from some part of Germany. I don't know, they call themselves Pennsylvania.
yeah,
Dutch,
I
but
don't remember the background of
And
the,
it is also a German dialect.
yeah, sorry, I think you, Ona, and then.
You know, I feel a little guilty, I haven't read it, I just found that you. Like, I mean, a lot of the, like, is it like keep what's living, like, the a lot of, you talk about the children, that had children. They could have been from the abuse, I'm sure a lot of the children.
Well, we're in the book, I don't know how, I don't know real, but in the book, it's mentioned that some of the women were, because how could they not, how could there not have been pregnancy? So in the novel, there's only Ona is the one who is pregnant, and obviously one of the abusers because she's not married, so, but then you find out also in the story of other kinds of violation. And so there must have been, but she said, so what would happen? What happens, at least there's the comment in the story at one point, that if a woman is pregnant and does give birth, I mean, there's one where the woman has a very terribly premature little child that doesn't live, but when they do, they're shipped off to another of the other two Mennonite colonies. That's what they do. The children, they're not. If it's known that the woman that the pregnancy is not from her husband, at least that's the novel. So I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it seems like it's a farming community, and they live in houses and some of them are wealthy. Their crops do well. I think they have canola fields, I think was what I read in Bolivia. So.
Part of it is that none of it's recorded, right? Like the births are not recorded, the education is not recorded because everything is even local, like in Canadian communities, it's homeschooling, but it's not really, it's their own.
But would they not, I mean, I don't know how it is in Bolivia, but I would think in Manitoba, the births are.
Social services to go there, they do check it out.
I'm sure, but I don't know what frequency is.
But not in Bolivia, but that's why they moved, I don't know what it's now like in Bolivia, but that's why they was, because in what I was reading, that they went to Mexico, that was closer from Canada.
Yeah.
But then Mexico's laws got a little too strict for them, and then they moved further south where they would be left alone.
Like there was a community in Rawdon in the eighties and they moved down to the Dominican Republic. Because they didn't like social services coming in and.
Telling them what to do, yeah.
But many of the Mennonite communities in the States sell drugs. There's a whole bunch of, yeah, sell drugs.
So they went out, sell drugs,
Yeah,
I don't know, I don't know.
Where would they get them?
they go,
Oh, do you mean like marijuana?
I don't know what drug, but there was a special law, the PBS, so, whatever, yeah.
Okay,
Possible. I just want to let everybody know we've got an event on the 21st called You've Got to Read This.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping you guys are coming to that one.
oh, I saw that, yes.
So it's the librarians that will be presenting, so that should be fun.
Okay. We need the room.
Yeah.
We need the room. Okay, sorry. That is right.
There's somebody here.
I know, I'll talk to you after outside, it's okay.
Normally I would be there, but we